Day 1, Easter Sunday, April 14th, 1968. As Brigadier John Enoch Powell, Conservative Member of Parliament for Wolverhampton South West, approached a fork in the street, he allowed himself a rueful gaze to the right, down solidly middle-class Compton Road. He'd have thought his older daughter Susan might be too fatigued from an afternoon of horse riding to notice his momentary inattention to the road ahead. But in the rearview mirror he glimpsed her questioning eyes. After Enoch managed to ease the car to the left, towards the house on the less desirable Merrydale Road, he glanced in the mirror again. Susan was gazing out of the side window. Enoch was aware that his dubious driving skills were noted within the family, though rarely mentioned. He prayed his daughter's mind was cantering across a Shropshire field, rather than dwelling on his shortcomings. That his daughters, or anybody else, come to that, might consider him lacking, was anathema to Enoch. His flesh crawled at the very idea. Compton Road, the object of Enoch's hankering glance, marked the boundary of an area where many of Wolverhampton's professionals lived. Doctors, bank managers, and lawyers. Apart from a couple of enterprising Asian families, residents were exclusively white-skinned. To the left, on Merrydale Road and adjoining streets, more modest houses had been built. Opposite the semi-detached Powell residence sat a row of narrow, terraced houses. The neighborhood, Enoch had noticed, was becoming home to an increasing number of West Indians, and Pakistanis. Enoch stopped the car outside the house he and his Susan Pam bought in 1954, the year Susan was born. The cost was £1,500. Exactly his annual salary at the time. Perhaps they could have stretched to a more expensive location, but Enoch was aware of the precariousness of political life and insisted they save for the inevitable rainy day. And it wasn't as if they'd be there permanently. They lived in London when Parliament was in session. The Wolverhampton house was perfectly serviceable, especially after Enoch's skill in carpentry provided improvements. A modest bay window gave some light to the front room, although the rest of the house was gloomy. On first inspection of the house, Enoch, ever the classics scholar, was charmed by carved stone leaves on the capitals of 2 square columns, supporting the roof of a narrow porch. The property boasted a back garden, where Enoch planted lettuces in regimented rows. The distance between seedlings carefully calibrated to ensure each was perfectly equidistant from the next. But as he held the car door open for his 11-year-old daughter Jennifer, Enoch wondered if his investment would have been more secure in the middle-class enclave bordered by Compton Road rather than the humbler Merrydale Road neighborhood, more susceptible to an influx of immigrants and the resulting reduction in property value. Monetary loss was never Enoch's overarching concern, however. In the same year he bought the house, he was part of a group who succeeded in pressuring Churchill to defer the provision of an annual £500 to MPs for expenses. How could you expect voters to approve when you took more of their tax money than they'd reckoned on when they elected you? No, it was the possibility that he'd made a mistake that irked Enoch. The actual nature of the mistake was secondary. Added to this was the feeling that, once again, he was an outsider, a state so familiar to him he was rarely conscious of it. But in this case, being of his own making, it was galling to think he'd put himself and his family on the wrong side of the tracks, so to speak. "Jeffer," Enoch called after his younger daughter Jennifer, "you've left your riding hat on the front seat. A purposeful and deliberate act is one thing, but if done through carelessness, you'll waste time looking for it next time you need it." Jennifer retrieved her hat and marched into the house after her sister. Enoch was pleased to see that she appeared to bear him no ill will. A lesser child may have been resentful. Enoch was not oblivious to the fact that he talked to his children differently than most parents, but his goal was to always get his point across as precisely as possible, no matter who he addressed. Otherwise, what was the point? Enoch made sure all the car doors were locked before following his daughter. As he turned, he caught sight of a woman who appeared to be Indian, emerging from one of the terraced houses across the street. The collar of her nurse's uniform was clearly visible under her navy blue mackintosh. When their eyes met, the nurse waved. Enoch waved back. Obviously encouraged, the woman glanced left and right before hurrying across the road. "Mr. Powell, sir, I want to thank you for bringing me to this country." Enoch understood immediately. The woman had obviously arrived under his watch when the party had been in power a few years earlier. "I'm not sure I'm deserving of your gratitude," he said. "Certainly, I was Minister of Health, but recruitment was in the hands of the hospital authorities. Given there was no bar upon employment to those like you from the Commonwealth, they were able to employ whosoever they wished, as long as the likely candidate was qualified." "But as health minister, you must have..." Enoch cut her off by addressing her in Urdu. He asked her how much longer her training was to last, and to where in India she planned to return. The nurse took a few seconds before replying. "I don't know what you're saying, or where you think I spring from." Enoch frowned. Eyebrows normally sloping up to his temples became glowering horizontal lines. Creases scored the high dome of his forehead, beneath a gleaming quiff, oddly luxuriant in the center of his receding hairline. I was born in Jamaica. My mother and father too," said the woman. "Their fathers were brought from India to work in the plantations, but I never been there in my life." Damn, another mistake. Enoch swallowed, took a breath. "Nevertheless, your thanks remain misplaced, for the reasons I outlined," he said. Enoch turned as if to disappear into his house, but at the last minute he spun on his heel. "How much longer do you have to train before returning home?" he asked. "Train? I've been a staff nurse at the Royal the last 3 years. My husband and I just bought that house over there." She nodded her head across the road. Then she hesitated for a second or two, appearing to be searching for the words. But then she blurted, "We're here to stay." "Really? Well, good day to you," said Enoch, and he strode the few steps to his front porch. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see that it was the nurse's turn to frown as she stood, staring at his retreating figure. After he closed the front door after him, Enoch repeated a phrase he'd uttered more than once as health minister during the nurses' strike when opposition MPs tried to make recruitment from overseas an issue. "The best available figures show that less than 7% of nurses have come from the Commonwealth." What he didn't add at the time, but said out loud at that moment, standing in his shadowy hall, was, "And they were a bloody sight cheaper than the British nurses. I saved the government thousands." "Tea, Enoch?" He looked up to see his wife Pam standing at the end of the hallway. His irritation drained away. God, but he was lucky to have found her. He couldn't have come across a better candidate if he'd posted a personal ad. Something like, "Brigadier and future Viceroy of India wishes to meet private school-educated young woman with a lively interest in politics, preferably the daughter of an officer of the Indian Army, with first-hand knowledge of the subcontinent. She should be a natural Tory, have professional experience in the higher echelons of Westminster, be able to type, and enjoy travel. An open face, good teeth, and a short but full figure are preferred." Pam ticked all the boxes, plus some more Enoch hadn't been aware of until he encountered the sum total of her endearing qualities. She was eternally good-natured, and seemed to flourish when she came to work for him as his secretary. He hadn't minded when he discovered her effusive morning greetings were the ruse with the other secretaries for a wager to see who could be the first to make him say good morning. He hadn't known he was aloof until then. Later, he overheard Pam telling someone she thought Enoch very attractive. His eyes are very blue and mesmeric, and he's great fun. He deduced he'd become more affable. But it was some time before romance developed, not until Pam was helping him in his second election campaign in Wolverhampton. When she returned home to London for a weekend, Enoch found himself missing her. So much so that he went to meet her on Sunday evening, only to find her train had been delayed. That October night, as he waited for Pam on a cold, foggy platform, he realized he wanted to marry her. Fate had provided a better strategy to win her affection than any Enoch could have devised. Pam's expression when she stepped down from her severely overdue train to find that he'd been waiting hours for her couldn't have been more gratifying. But first things first, he delayed proposing to her until he'd won the election. After the unfortunate misunderstanding of his last and only other proposal, Enoch made sure Pam understood exactly what he was asking of her, and the likely consequences if she accepted. Grinding poverty and a husband who was a permanent backbencher. His modesty hadn't been completely false. He recognized he was an anomaly within the Tory ranks and might be sidelined at any point. Labour's defeat, coupled with Pam's acceptance on the stipulation that she'd never be asked to cook tripe, made 1951 a very good year for Enoch. "If you want, you can go up and I'll bring your tea," said Pam. "I've left the transcript on the desk." Although she always typed his speeches from his handwritten draft, Pam had been reluctant to give up her role as a driver. Enoch never conceded his driving was as inept as Pam claimed. He'd hoped his account of learning during World War II in a 3,000-weight army truck while travelling 3,000 miles across North Africa might have excused his erratic driving style. But Pam was unimpressed. He'd learnt to ride a horse too, and was a much more accomplished rider than a driver. He threw himself into fox hunting the minute he got back to England, often taking the underground, dressed in jodhpurs and hacking jacket, to ride to hounds at a hunt on the outskirts of London. After a number of minor traffic collisions, he tacitly agreed Pam should take the driver's seat whenever possible. The idea for the speech took shape during a shadow cabinet meeting Enoch had attended before leaving London. The discussion about the proposed race relations bill was a complete fiasco. Ted Heath in particular had galled Enoch. He waffled about how, if they opposed an act that banned the refusal of housing or employment on the grounds of race or colour, they'd be labelled fascists. But as each of his colleagues agreed the best plan was to take the coward's route and merely table an amendment rather than outright oppose the bill, Enoch began to realize the situation was ripe with opportunity. The speech he was to give the following Saturday would allow him to ignite the fuse the act provided and blow the issue wide open. He held his tongue, knowing it would lead the others to believe he was in agreement with them. Immediately after the meeting, they motored, Pam driving, to Wolverhampton, where Enoch started in on the speech that would surely change his fortune. After several handwritten drafts, he'd been desperate to see it typewritten. Pam reluctantly agreed to type it that morning, while he drove the girls to riding class. The warmth of Pam's voice told Enoch she approved, or at least she didn't disapprove. Despite the unshakable conviction that he had no option than to go ahead with the speech, Enoch had to admit to a feeling of relief. But, despite his wife's tacit approbation, Enoch knew the speech needed something in addition to heartfelt expressions of selflessness and the drama of classical allusion. He'd included a barrage of attention-grabbing statements designed to appeal to hoi polloi, as he sometimes referred to the majority, in a nod to his knowledge of ancient Greek, hoipoloi, meaning the many. But to make certain these devices didn't sail over the heads of a larger proportion of the population, those with little or no education, whose understanding was vital, he needed an anecdote or two, morsels from what he believed everyday life had become, stories that even the most benighted would understand. Time was ticking. He had less than a week before the Conservative Political Centre meeting in Birmingham. He may have no option but to resort to the source he'd consulted for his Walsall speech. He was reluctant to return to that particular font, but, if needs must, he would.